Welcome back to Pen and Reel. I'm your host, Uncle Joel, and today we're going to be continuing our coverage of Dark Knight's Death Metal by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. Now, after issue 3 dropped in August, we took a break from the main event for all of September, and we focused on tie-ins. Now, up until this point, I've not been too happy with the main event, but it's not really lived up to my expectations or what I thought or hoped it could be. In all honesty, I felt kind of like dropping the book at one point. However, I felt like the majority of the tie-ins were really good and justified and redeemed the event to a degree. And yet, I remain skeptical about the main book. So going into the break month, issue number 3 really set up for the individual tie-ins. And seeing as how the main book really set up for the tie-ins, I had an idea of how issue number 4 would rein everything back in. And, sure enough, this book hit exactly to expectations. And the thing is, I'm not really sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You see, we get a single page that really ties the tie-ins back into the main event. And so you kind of get a recap of those tie-ins very briefly, just a quick synopsis. But it sets the stage so that you know, okay, here's what happened in the tie-ins, and you know, okay, this is where we're picking up. And so if you've read the tie-ins, it flows smoothly from issue 3 in through the tie-ins and then now into issue 4. And yet, at the same time, if you haven't read the tie-ins, it gives you pretty much the main information that you need to know so that you can pick up straight from issue 3 into issue 4. Like, you don't have to have read the tie-ins in order for this to work. And so in that regard, I do feel like it was handled decently. It just falls back on what most event books tend to do, and that's have a bunch of tie-ins that really aren't important to the overall plot. Like, you can not have those tie-ins and have the main event totally fine. Which on the one hand I think is really good for people not having to buy all of these individual tie-ins in order to appreciate the main event. And while on the one hand I do appreciate that you can enjoy the main event without having to purchase all of these tie-ins, it does make the tie-ins feel a bit tertiary and unimportant overall. When you look at Trinity Crisis or Multiverse's End, they didn't really do a whole lot to further the main event. They just added a little bit of needed depth there. The only one-shot that I felt like really justified its existence independent of the main book was Speed Metal. And that's because it provided a much-needed development for Wally West and the Flashes. And yet, where issue number 4 picks up, it doesn't feel like there's been any development between issue number 3 and issue number 4. And so I really do have mixed feelings about it. As I mentioned, I do appreciate that you don't need to read the tie-ins in order to enjoy the main book. But the way it reads just in the main event, you wouldn't necessarily know that these tie-ins even exist. But, tie-ins aside, I do really appreciate that issue number 4 slows down quite a bit compared to the way the first 3 issues worked. The first 3 issues just charged forward at full speed, throwing out all kinds of ideas and strange concepts and not really caring to slow down and explore the characters much. Aside from a few quick moments, the majority of it was just breakneck pace. This issue, however, I feel like actually takes the time to explore the concepts being put forward, and allows the characters time to breathe and reflect and experience the situations that they're in. Now, in doing so, I feel like there's not a lot of forward momentum in the plot in comparison to the first 3 issues, so it does slow down the pace quite a bit, but personally, I quite appreciate that. And towards the end of this issue, we get a major turning point that is immediately followed by another major turning point. And I really don't want to spoil what those are in case you haven't read the issue. But I feel like the second turning point really strips the weight from the first turning point. And I do think that was intentional. I feel like Scott Snyder was trying to pull the rug out from under the reader. But personally, I feel like that would have been a little bit more effective if there was just a little bit more space between the 2 turning points. Give us a bit more time of building the first turning point up so that we can really get ourselves attached to it and have these new expectations, and only then have those expectations dashed. The only other thing I can really say about this issue without getting into spoilers too much is when Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman go into the Dark Multiverse to go to these different crises, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, and Final Crisis, they react in shock when they find that these crises are not what they were expecting. Which, that for me felt a bit disingenuous, as they are already familiar with the Dark Multiverse and have an understanding of what it is. So knowing and understanding that the Dark Multiverse is born of their fears, naturally, these crises are going to be darker versions of those crises. And that's kind of emblematic of one of my problems that I'm having with this series. The way Scott Snyder's writing it, a lot of things don't necessarily make sense for the characters and for the world as it exists. It feels more like certain things are happening because they need to happen for the story, not so much because it makes sense continuity-wise. For instance, Superman acted really out of character in one scene in Trinity Crisis, and then now here, it doesn't make sense for them to be acting in surprise that a universe in the Dark Multiverse is darker and different than what actually happened to them in the main universe. They shouldn't have that moment of shock. I understand why that moment of shock might happen as a story beat, but it doesn't make sense for the characters. But at this point, I do feel like this issue does bring things a little bit more in lines of what my hopes and expectations were for this event from the beginning. So I'm hoping that maybe the delay from earlier in the year really allowed Scott Snyder to take the time to flesh things out and really focus on the pacing, so that at least this second half of the series will really pick up and hone in on the core story as opposed to all of the zany concepts. At this point, I am cautiously hopeful for issue number 5, and I'm definitely looking forward to more of the tie-ins. So if you've stuck with the series up until this point, I'd say keep going. There does appear to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Let's just hope we're not hallucinating. But if you've read the issue, what do you think? Do you appreciate that the story slowed down a bit and allowed more time to breathe for the events that happen in the book? Or do you just want to see more crazy Batman showing up and throwing out all kinds of crazy concepts and exploring just the weird corners of the Metalverse? Do you have any guesses as to where the story is going to go from here? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. And if you could help me out with my battle against the YouTube algorithm by hitting like, I'd really appreciate it. And make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of my Dark Knight's death metal coverage. And until next time, this is Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.